Yeah.
If you're ready.
Well, he's got 1 minute, is what he's got.
It's actually going, so I'm going to be bouncing between rooms.
All right.
You got my presentation.
In that case, yeah, what's your title?
I'm the Director of Disability Services.
At PCC. Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm Raul again. Hey, hi. When we were putting together this conference, I knew we needed to have some sessions on accessibility. And people kept actually mentioning Kaela Park to me, who, Kaela Parks at Portland Community College, who's the Director of Accessibility Services up there, and they told me that I need to speak to her. And as luck would have it, I was able to speak to her, and she agreed to do a presentation for us, and so I am now going to hand it off to Kaela.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kaela Parks. I'm the Director of Disability Services at Portland Community College, and I'm really excited today because our topic is disability as a driver for innovation. And I hope to share some practical examples, as well as I think some kind of philosophical underpinnings that can guide the work we do. And I will welcome questions. And there is a catch box that we'll use to capture any of those questions or comments from the room. Sound good? So the first slide that I have today to share is actually a picture of a person attending a conference using a Braille terminal. And I'm curious, I'd love to have a show of hands if people can say, have you ever had experience with a Braille terminal? Have people met this technology before? I'm seeing lots of shaking heads no. I see a couple of hands. So I'm just going to explain briefly what this kind of technology is, how it's used, what it does, because I think it helps to establish some shared understanding as we're moving forward around the kind of options that exist today. So this gadget that is being held in someone's lap is a Braille terminal, and it has two different parts. One part of it is a display, and we can see in the image that there are little dots that are raised in a portion of this device. And this is what's called the refreshable Braille display, right? The other part down lower is a Braille keyboard. Now, these kinds of devices, you can get them in a variety of configurations, right? You could have a standard QWERTY keyboard or a Braille keyboard like this. You could have differing numbers of cells for the Braille to be displayed. But in general, you can think of a device like this kind of like either a PDA or even a full laptop, depending on the system and depending on the device you get. But the idea is it has an operating system, it has some different connections possible. And so what this person is doing in this conference is using this device to be able to interact with the information and what's happening in the room in a way that's equivalent to peers who might not be using that kind of device, right? So as an example, have people heard of a screen reader before? Let's start with that. I see heads nodding. People have heard of screen readers. Awesome. Screen readers are amazing, right? It's a piece of software that can intercept what's happening on the display and then render auditory feedback to a user. So they know what would be displayed visually, but they can instead hear it, right? Often we're hearing it as synthetic speech. But the other thing screen readers can do is they can pass that information to a device like this, so that what's presented perhaps visually on a screen is instead rendered as Braille on the device itself. So this is pretty neat, right? Has anyone ever seen hard copy Braille before? I see some heads nodding. Can you imagine the volume? Like if you're at a conference with a lot of different sessions, there's a lot of different materials that might be shared. If you want to enjoy that, you don't necessarily want to take a suitcase with you everywhere you go with all that Braille hard copy, right? It's rough. Instead, though, with a device like this, a person can connect to, let's say, the conference website. They can grab those attachments and files, bring them to the device, open them, and then as the cursor moves through the lines of text, rather than displaying them on a screen, that content can be displayed as Braille. So those little pins are raising and lowering to represent each line of text as we're moving through the document. Does that make sense? It's nifty technology, right? The other thing a person could be doing is taking their own notes, just like others might do, maybe using a laptop, even using pen and paper. So this is a communication device that can both bring information and render it in a tactile format, or with earbud, you could listen through the screen reader, or you could be composing, interacting. Somebody might be using this who's blind, who has their ears to the room, but someone who's deaf and blind could be using this to be accessing a real-time transcript of what's being said through that tactile format. So my point is, technology's cool. This is pretty powerful stuff, right? And I think that that's what draws a lot of us to technology and education, is this idea that it can open doors. So I have on the screen now an image of a door that's just opening, a door that's ajar, right? But I picked this image because it also has a big question mark on the door, right? It's not automatic or automagic, as we might say, for the technology that we design, develop, and put out there for people to actually open doors for everyone, right? It's entirely possible to have technology that creates an opening for some people, but that is really more of a door slamming shut for others, or just staying shut. Maybe it hasn't been opened yet, right? Does that make sense? So the potential is there, but there's enormous responsibility that comes with how we craft these doors, how we make sure they're open to everyone. And that's where I think sometimes we see what's presented as, I think it's a false dilemma, right? It's this notion that accessibility and innovation are at odds. Has anyone heard that kind of sentiment before? I see some heads nodding. I hear it in different ways, honestly. Sometimes I hear this kind of thing in meetings where faculty are talking about adopting maybe some new platform that's highly innovative, but that's not yet accessible. I think a high-profile example is the Berkeley case. Folks know about that, where Berkeley had a lot of videos online of lectures and things that were opened up to the public, but they weren't all captioned. And there was some pushback around that, and then Berkeley made the decision to pull it all down. People know about that. Some people know about it, some people don't. It's an interesting story, and if you read, you'll hear differing points of view on it. But the idea, I think, is that in some ways, that whole case strengthened this notion that accessibility and innovation are at odds, right? That there's exciting new technologies, and we want to make them available, but if we do that, there's a cost, which is they're not accessible yet. Or if we want to be fully accessible, it means we're not able to do some of the innovative things that people might want to do. And that's a central tension in my field, right? Because I do work in disability services. I work in the part of our shared efforts that is focused on equity, that is focused on making sure people have equally effective opportunities to engage. And so there's this kind of wrestling or this tension that's just inherent when you're talking about something that moves as rapidly as technology does and that is as exciting as it is, that there's this tension. But I want to share some examples and maybe some ways of thinking about this that run in a different direction. Okay, what I have on the slide for you right here is a picture of legs. A bunch of legs, and they belong to Aimee Mullins. Has anyone heard of Aimee Mullins? She's a Paralympic athlete and a model and a public speaker. She has a TED Talk that she did a while back, and it was called The Opportunity of Adversity. And in it, she's really talking about her experience as a young girl and having a double amputation, losing both of her legs below the knee, and about what that felt like in terms of identity, and who is she as a person, and how do people see her, and what are the expectations, and what are the limitations, right? And she talks a lot about how disability can be framed as an obstacle to overcome, or as a hurdle to overcome, or as a burden to bear, or any of these kinds of metaphors. People have probably heard them before, right? And she rejected that, and she said, you know, humans adapt. Humans innovate. That's what we do. And often we need a trigger for that, and disability can be a trigger for that. And so the image I selected, to me, there's kind of multiple layers to this, right? One is that these prosthetic legs represent technology, right? And they represent different approaches to technology. So we have an example of a leg that's wearing a sandal that looks very much like, I'm going to use air quotes, a normal leg, right? With that leg on, she can blend in. We also see a leg on the far side that's built for speed. She's a Paralympic athlete, right? This has made use of the technology that's available. It's not trying to mimic the human form so much as to create a more efficient mechanism for running. And what's interesting is that the notion of disability as a deficit is in some ways challenged when you look at an example like that, because she's not allowed to compete against able-bodied athletes because there's a perception that with this prosthetic, she's now superhuman, right? That it's not that the prosthetic is making her equal to others, it's that now she has an advantage because this leg is using technology in ways that allow her to go faster. It's an interesting twist there. But then on the other side, we see these legs that are beautifully carved wooden art pieces, right? And so it's the chance to say, we can use technology to go beyond what was our baseline. We can use technology to do things in a new way. We can challenge some of the assumptions about what legs are supposed to look like in this example. But there's another part of this image that always troubles me, or part of this story, I guess, which is that not everyone is a Paralympic superstar, supermodel, public speaker, right? Not everyone has artists who are eager to build custom, beautiful wooden sculpted legs that can walk down a runway, or to build these incredibly high-tech legs for sprinting so fast, right? For a lot of people, the technology you're gonna get is what your insurance is gonna pay for, right? That's it. So it better be good, because however good it is, however versatile it is, it's what you're gonna have to rely on. So this notion that disability can be a trigger for innovation is important, but also that there's an ethical responsibility to look at what the technology we develop is and who it's available to, because not everyone will have access to the same options. And partly, I'm coming from a community college, right? We have a commitment to open access. So I think about these things often when I'm working with students who may be homeless, can't afford that Braille display, but nonetheless, they're here. And education is meant to be their path to a better future. How do we reconcile these gaps in what people have access to and what we view as standard tech versus really kind of cool, exciting, out there tech? Does that make sense? Okay, so now I want to take us back in time. I want to talk about disability as a driver of innovation using some technology examples from years past. The typewriter. Does anybody else love typewriters? A couple people do. I love my typewriter. I realize that I have other options now, but there is a place in my heart for my typewriter. And I think this is an interesting story. It's a love story, you guys. It's a love story. And there's some murkiness, you know, a lot of history. You hear different renditions, you hear different versions of how things happened. But there's a story about an Italian countess. Her name was Carolina. She was supposed to be very, very beautiful, very popular, this countess, and she lost her sight at a young age. As a young woman, she went completely blind. And she was married at the time. But there was this Italian inventor, Pellegrino Turri, there we are. And he was quite smitten with her. They were friends, special friends. They were both married. And they had a problem in that they couldn't communicate very well, given that they couldn't write letters and pass them back and forth without having someone assist Carolina. And that put their secret relationship in jeopardy, right? So the motivation for the typewriter, turns out, may have been a desire to facilitate independent communication with a lover. And it's an interesting story. There's similar reports of a typewriter being developed around the same time frame by Agostino Fantoni, also Italian, same time frame. But for him, it was a desire to help his sister, who was blind, have a way to communicate independently. So in either version of the story, whichever one is true, or maybe neither one are, who knows, but the idea that there's this motivating factor to develop technology, to innovate, to come up with a new way, because what was in place wasn't working, right? So as a woman who was blind, the technology available to her was pen and paper. She couldn't use that independently. He used his inventive engineering skills to come up with a way to tactily produce written documents so they could share communication. It's an interesting story. How about the telephone? Alexander Graham Bell. I don't know if everyone knows this, but he was primarily a teacher of the deaf. Before anything else, he was a teacher of the deaf. And his mother was hard of hearing, so he and his brothers and his father had spent a lot of formative time trying to understand sound and experimenting and using technology. And this idea of electronic speech and what ultimately became the telephone, it really came from his interest, his high motivation around facilitating communication for people who are deaf. So that's where we get our telephone. So it starts out, the spur, the drive, the innovation comes from wanting to facilitate communication for people who are deaf, turns into everyone has a phone, right? And if we fast forward, we think about the phones we use today, right? Texting is as much or more of our use than the voice communication. Texting also was developed to improve communication access for people who are deaf. So here we have two different examples, the typewriter and the telephone, where really it is a spark to innovate, to close a gap around a disability-related experience. How about the email and internet that we rely on, right? Vint Cerf, folks know that name? Chief Internet Evangelist and VP at Google. He's been hard of hearing since birth, and his wife is also deaf. And in the 70s, when he was in the tech field, one of the main ways that people were working was by using the telephone, right? So we can thank Alexander Graham Bell and his motivation. But that's how a lot of the business meetings were being conducted. And this was a real problem for Vinton. He couldn't hear well, it wasn't working well for him, it was not effective, not efficient. And this was a real motivator for him in terms of the work that he contributed that was really integral to that development of IP networks, right? So email, IP protocol, internet, this comes from a desire to communicate and share information because the existing technology wasn't working. The existing technology was focused on voice communication, and as a person who was hard of hearing, it didn't cut it. This is a picture. Vint Cerf is known as the father of the internet, and I always think he's kind of like a stern papa when it comes to accessibility. And this is one of his quotes. He said, it can't be a pixie dust that you sprinkle on top and then suddenly make it accessible. He said, accessibility should be a design choice that is rewarded, something a lot of companies have not stepped up to. So that's a key idea, right? Things have to be baked in, not sprinkled on top. And I think, again, about what I said at the beginning about that tension that we see between innovation and accessibility. And I think a lot of that tension comes from this notion that you can innovate and develop and produce and then somehow circle back around to address accessibility. And that approach is what creates the tension, because now it's something extra. Now it's more work on top. Now it's something else we need to do, right? As opposed to being a driver and infused from the outset. So it's a key concept, I think, in this whole conversation around accessibility, innovation, and universal design. I want to share a practical example. Captioning, right? I would imagine how many people in the room are dealing with captioning in some way. I'm seeing, yeah, most of the hands get raised, right? And it's just true that we use multimedia content in our educational delivery in different ways now than we did in the past. So we have not only things like flipped classrooms where we're trying to present a lot of content ahead of time so we can use class time for more interactions. We have student-generated media taking up more space in our shared learning environments. We have, of course, all of the readily available clips and other sources that people want to bring in to infuse current events in the learning environment. So there's lots and lots of examples where multimedia content is more prevalent. But there's a question that doesn't always get asked, which is, how do we view captioning, right? What is it that we think of when we think of captioning? And there's different topics that can be explored here. I mean, certainly we can talk about what's the best way to actually get the captioning done from a technical perspective. We can talk about what are the best ways to maybe pool dollars from multiple departments or regions to be able to invest and get the best cost effectiveness out of our captioning approach. These are all good conversations to have, right? But the piece I'm asking is, what is it that we view captioning as, right? Is it an accommodation? Is it something that we're circling back around and adding after the fact to ensure that people who are deaf and hard of hearing have access? Something that we're doing maybe to minimize risk from a legal compliance standpoint? Something we're doing because we know we have to? Or is it something we're doing because it makes good business sense, or because it's just good teaching, right? These are the questions, and I think that we don't always articulate them explicitly. We don't always talk specifically about how we're viewing something like captioning, but we make business decisions, and we put practice into place based on those kind of philosophical underpinnings. On the screen now, I have an example of a video clip that has a magnification kind of drawing focus to a search box with a transcript. And I want to tell you just a little story. I guess it was about 12 years ago. I was in Alaska at the time, and I had built a course, and it was accessible multimedia, right? It was a service learning course, and it was built out of our College of Journalism and Public Communication. So it was enrolling mostly people who were about to graduate with their journalism and public communication degrees, but I also had other people who took it out of interest. The class was built to be service learning, meaning people would learn how to caption videos by, you guess it, captioning videos, right? And what we did is we partnered with nonprofits. So the students in the class would be paired up with, Fish and Wildlife, or a local nonprofit parents group, or what have you. And they would do the work of captioning the videos for that partner, and they would also kind of interview and get a better sense of what workflows were like and how it was that captioning wasn't a part of the standard flow. What was interesting is one of these partnerships was with the Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Arctic Training and Research Center. This is Alaska. This was way up in the Arctic region. And they were doing some really incredible work, but hardly anybody knew about it, right? Partly because, they're geographically isolated, but also because it's a pretty niche it was a very specific area of research. So they were producing these incredible videos, presenting on research that was happening, all kinds of really good stuff, but it wasn't captioned, which is why they were a partner for us in this service learning course. Well, something really interesting happened. Once we did that work of captioning the videos they started seeing their hit counts just jump, right? Is anybody surprised by that? No, right? Because we know now why this is not that surprising. Once you add the text-based transcript that contains all of what was being said, now some of that key jargon, some of those key medical terms, some of those obscure references were visible to the search engines, right? So people who were in other parts of the world, whether they were researchers, doctors, or parents, who were searching out some of these keywords, all of a sudden they were finding them where before they hadn't been. Because even if you're adding in some additional metadata, if you don't have the full spoken transcript, you're just missing a lot of the juicy connection points. So my point is that when we did this work through the service learning course, what happened was a moment of like realization for this training center, this research and training center. And they realized we don't need to caption our videos just because we want to make sure people who are deaf and hard of hearing can access them. We need to caption our videos because we need our content to be found. So from a search engine optimization standpoint alone, from a business model standpoint alone, it now became essential and needed to be baked in and was no longer seen as something to be dusted on top. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I think that, findability is an important part when we're talking about this. But there's also searchability. And that's why the image I selected is actually focused in on this search video option. How many of you all provide interactive transcripts for multimedia content for students? I see some hands. It's incredible, is what I can say, to be able as a learner to use keyword searches to jump to the parts of the video that you need. It helps students study more effectively, right? So if we're taking into mind again, like that flipped classroom model as an example. So a student at home watches a lecture, takes notes, goes into the classroom, interacts with peers, begins working on a project, and then has a thought, oh, I remember something about that in the lecture, right? I remember that we talked about that. There was a piece that I want to review. Being able to jump back in and type in that key search word and jump right to that location means that that student hasn't lost the steam of continuing on that thought that drove them there in the first place, right? They're able to review that tantalizing bit that they wanted to revisit and then still have time to move on and do what they wanted to do with it. In the absence of that, you might remember that it was about a third of the way through, and you might be scrubbing the timeline, trying to find it. But the efficiency of being able to search by keyword is powerful as a technique. Now, there's another element of this, which I probably should switch out my image because this one doesn't show it, but do you all know about, with YouTube, being able to have different languages for your right. So the other thing that we're finding is students may choose to have the captions on screen in one language, but have the interactive transcript down below in a different language. So for someone who's learning the language, being able to match up the key terminology, you're hearing how it's pronounced, you're seeing how it's spelled in English, and you're getting the reference of that same key term in another language. Does that make sense? It's incredible stuff, right? And I think my mind always goes to how I can involve students. I believe in student development and finding ways to engage. So I'll tell you, one of the other projects that we did at the same time we had that service learning course where we were teaching people how to caption by having them caption nonprofits' videos. Alaska, because of where it's located, has a huge international population. It was great. So what we were able to do is we were able to actually translate subtitle files. We would do them first in English with accurate timing, and then we would translate and have them proofread. Because, I'll be honest, Google Translate is great, but it is not perfect, right? No automatic translation is going to be as accurate as a native speaker. Because you can do word for word translation, fine, but meaning for meaning, and the way people talk, idioms, all of the funny stuff we say, it doesn't always translate that well. But for a student, especially a student who's new to a university and trying to feel connected, being able to have a role like that in doing the language translation for subtitles for videos that are shared through the university was a really kind of powerful connection point. And so we offered work study positions, we also offered service learning. There were a variety of ways for that to happen, but it was this neat partnership where we had students captioning content and we had other students then rendering that content in different languages to support each other as a community of learners. So it was, I think, innovative use of technology, but with some real clear kind of goals and outcomes for students, for student development, and for increasing the reach and power and effectiveness of those videos. And I think a lot of it, when we're talking again about kind of these philosophical underpinnings, right? When we're thinking about, is captioning an accommodation Or is accommodation good business? I mean, captioning good business? Or is captioning good teaching? Or is it all of those? Some of it comes down to what we choose to track, right? So I'm a manager. I'm expected to track things, right? But I think often, when it comes to things like captioning, some of the assumptions or expectations are around tracking for the purpose of cost projection, right? So what I have on the screen right now is a trend line showing an increase that's hand-drawn over like a bar chart. And I guess my point is that this kind of chart is very common. We see something is increasing. But the question is, what is it we're measuring and what does it matter, right? So sometimes I think that people get in the habit of what I call counting the widgets, right? Like this many requests for this kind of thing. But ultimately, what does that mean, right? I think that we often see a chart like this when people are talking about captioning and they're talking about, well, there's more video to be captioned. There's more dollars that are going to be needed. There's more, and it's kind of this anxiety-producing conversation sometimes, honestly. But I think that this same kind of chart could also be tracking increase in hit counts once you do caption the videos, increase in satisfaction from students who are leveraging some of those interactive transcript features, right? So it depends on what you track. It depends on how you frame it, the kind of conversation you're going to have around how to scale efforts. And I think that there are important conversations to have around a topic like this in terms of being strategic, right? How do you make a workflow efficient? How do you ensure you're being a good steward of funds? These are all important conversations. But the one I'm talking about is a little bit different. It's more about, again, that philosophical underpinning. What is it we choose to track? What is it we value? What is it we're interested in? And historically, it's been captioning as accommodation, right? And so that takes an active change. Good news is there's quite a bit of research out there now to support this kind of shift. Have people seen, this is on screen, I have a little image that came from this report that 3Play Media did in conjunction with Oregon State University e-learning group. Have people seen this report before? I would encourage you to check it out. There's actually a couple of different reports, but this was a national study. So it's looking at college students at colleges and universities across the country and asking some questions about use of media. And it's pretty clear. I mean, what the students have to say is that, yeah, they do use the captions when they're available, not specifically related to deaf and hard of hearing, that they find them valuable, right? And some of the key ways that the students gave voice to this, they talked about, sometimes it's just hard to hear. Maybe the speaker talks a little too fast. Maybe there's a little bit of distortion in the audio. Maybe there's an accent that's a little harder to understand at part. All kinds of reasons. Having the captions help a learner who is hearing discern audio when it's ambiguous, right? Which helps us make meaning if we know the content. So perceiving. Another part is seeing that vocabulary, right? We know when we're talking about college and university courses, we're often throwing a lot of new terminology at learners. It's cognitive overload, but it's part of learning. So scaffolding helps, right? Being able to have the correct spelling of a word on screen while hearing how it's pronounced can really help people in learning and retaining that vocabulary. I mentioned earlier the translating language piece, and that's another piece that was recognized by the students in the study, talking about the value they got, and increasing focus. There's often a lot competing for our attention. And some of the students in the study were talking about how that multimodal input, being able to see the words and hear at the same time, help them stay focused on the task at hand. So the good news is, like I said, there is research to help support this kind of shift from thinking about accommodation, from thinking about captioning as an accommodation that we would do as needed for individual students, to thinking about captioning as something that we might do to help all students, right? And that really brings me to universal design. I think it's a great example of universal design. Is that a phrase that people have heard? I'm seeing some heads nod. Yeah, it's been around for a while. Gosh, there's been so many FIPSI grants, federal demonstration projects aimed at improving post-secondary student outcomes that focus on universal design. But really, I want to give you a definition first. It's the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And the father of universal design is Ron Mace. He has a really interesting story. He had polio when he was a kid, and he was an inventive engineering type. He actually created his own wheelchairs for different situations. But when he came of age to go to college, he tells a story about going up to, I don't know, it was a dean, someone in admissions at North Carolina State University, which was in his neck of the woods. And he talks about how he was told, basically, really sorry, don't see how this is going to work, right? Because this is before the ADA. This is even before Section 504. And North Carolina State had beautiful, beautiful old buildings, narrow doors, lots of stairs, and he's in a chair. And so the college admissions folk were just, I don't see how it's going to happen. Now, Ron did not like that answer. And Ron was actually really, really lucky because he had very strong family support. And what ended up happening for Ron is that his family members literally carried him in and out of the buildings for him to attend classes for 4 years. And he graduated on time with honors. Does anybody want to guess what field he chose to major in? Architecture. I heard it in the back. Yes. Architecture. Motivation, right? Motivation. Innovation. So when he graduated, he said, oh my gosh, we can do better than this. I know we can do better than this, right? Because as an architect, what had happened now is, this is time going by, right? So laws have been passed, and people are going around and trying to retrofit these old buildings. So we're having to slap a ramp on the front, or widen a doorway, or throw an elevator in the back. And it's not, the design wasn't built for it, and you can tell, right? And as an architect, he's like, well, I'm glad I can get in the building now, but wouldn't it be better if it was designed that way, right? And so he outlined 7 principles of universal design, and he founded the North Carolina State University Center for Universal Design, which is still going now. And these principles that he came up with, I think there's testimony in how kind of brilliant and common sense this was, because it's translated into so many fields since, right? So he's talking about things like simple and intuitive use, equivalent use, flexibility in use, right? These are principles that just make sense, but he outlined them in clear ways, and they were put into practice within architecture. So universal design is something that's well understood at this point and is practiced often in architecture, because it is a way to design for more people from the beginning and not have to go back and retrofit and adapt for each individual person. It was such a good idea that it moved from architecture into the design of everyday objects. And from there, it moved into other fields, namely education, which is where, as I mentioned, we've had a whole many series of federal demonstration projects aimed at applying universal design principles in teaching and learning environments. So there are many, many examples of universal design that people could see anywhere around you, right? Curb cuts are like the classic. Yes, they ensure someone using a wheelchair or scooter can get where they need to go, but they are also incredibly handy for people with strollers, wheeled bags, bicycles, any number of other situations. Same thing with push-button operators, or these kinds of levers that are on doors often now. You don't have to reach and grasp and twist. You can hit them with an elbow if you need to. If your hands are full of 2 coffees, that's often a go-to. So the idea is, again, that these are examples of technology that is designed specifically for a disability-related need, but that innovation then allows everyone to benefit because it's a better design, right? Other examples, I mentioned it moves into daily living. At my house, I have a lamp, and you just touch it to turn on. You don't have to grasp and twist People have seen those kinds, touch lamps. There's a lot of kitchen devices that have been developed, ergonomic jar openers, can openers, things that, again, are designed to be more usable to more people. Okay, so now I want to move us back into some examples of universal design that are related to educational technology in classrooms. Practical examples. So what I have on screen right now is just a little screenshot of an example of a software application. This one happens to be Read and Write by Text Help, but there are others. It could be any number of applications. The point I'm making is that it's site-wide licensing, right? So these kinds of programs, I think of them as file readers as opposed to screen readers. And I'll tell you why. Like the screen reader I mentioned earlier, it's assuming that there's no visual input, right? So it's going to tell you which applications are open, if there are form fields available, what you've entered, everything about what's happening is going to be available as synthetic speech or Braille. These programs are different. They are assuming that you do have visual input and that you want to have particular aspects of your experience modified. So for example, you might want to hear an article that you're looking at read out loud. And maybe you want the whole thing read, or maybe you want certain portions. You're going to be able to make those choices. You can pick which voice you want. Male, female, speed them up, slow them down, add more pauses between sentences, less. All those kinds of user controls. You're also going to have other kinds of features often, like dictionaries, and then you can hear the definitions read out loud. The particular application I have up right now also includes a picture dictionary feature, which is kind of neat. Many of these kinds of tools will allow you to not only listen to something being read out loud, but actually convert it to MP3, so you can listen other times. You can also create MP3s from text that you've written yourself. So from an active studying standpoint, these kinds of tools can be powerful for students. Not just students who have diagnosed disabilities, but students who are just a diverse bunch and learn in different ways, right? So again, this is about that tension or about that framing. If we view software like this as an accommodation, which is a historical model, then an office like mine will know about it and will make sure it's available to those individual students who have navigated the often bureaucratic process that is the accommodation process to get connected with us and then be, kind of granted this tool. You can probably tell that I favor a different way to go, which is to make tools like this available to everyone from the outset. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we know disability still carries stigma, right? And it means that students who experience disability may or may not be willing to subject themselves to a process where they have to self-identify and then continue to self-identify to faculty on a regular basis. Also, for hidden disabilities, there's a diagnostic hurdle. Getting access to a learning evaluation can be very difficult. So if you didn't get a diagnosis of a learning disability when you were in K-12 and then hold on to it preciously and never lose it, then you're kind of in a pickle, right? And they're not cheap. These evaluations, it ranges, but you're talking potentially $1,500, $1,800 for a full neuropsych. So there's a population who may well be experiencing hidden barriers, but they don't have the means to leverage the accommodation process. And we know that's true. So if we know that's true, and we know that technology like this can help support learners, then from my standpoint, there's an ethical responsibility to think about how we deploy that technology, right? And site-wide licensing can be a critical component. So at our institution, we make almost all of our access technologies available using concurrent licensing. Not all, but most. And this means students don't have to go to the, I'm using air quotes again, special lab, squirreled away in some part of campus. They know that they can go anywhere that we have supported computing opportunities. So computer labs and classrooms that have computer stations, students can know and expect that they're going to find the kinds of software that enable access on all of them. That's great. That's the first step, is making it available, but it's not sufficient. That's why I put site-wide licensing and tech support, right? Because there's always the critical question, how do I use it? What is it, right? Awareness. It's one thing to know it's there, it's another thing to know how to use it and to have practice and to have exposure. So one of the things that we did that's been really helpful is we created an Access Tech group. And this is comprised of individuals at our institution who are knowledgeable in these kinds of technologies. And we made it really easy to remember. We have a hotline phone number, PCC Tech, right? I couldn't believe it hadn't been taken already. When we had this idea, I was like, really? Those 4 digits are available? It's amazing. So it's an easy to remember hotline phone number and email address, accesstech@pcc, right? We make that available widely to students, to staff, and to faculty. And we offer individual or group training. We have drop-ins, we have scheduled times, and we go to the classroom as often as we can to try to integrate and make this something that's not something separate, dusted on top, extra, but something that's baked in, right? Right now, we have a partnership with our instructors who are teaching students who are learning English. And it means that they are using this tool in the classroom as part of instruction. Students are learning English, they're learning technology, and they're learning content. And they're learning all 3 together through that supported, kind of scaffolded approach. And we're not far enough into it to have as many results as I know we'll have down the line, but what we're hearing so far has been incredibly positive. We're putting Access Tech support who are knowledgeable in the use of the software into the labs so that after class, the tutors who work in those labs can get support in helping students use the tool. It's one of those things that I think takes a little bit of time. You have to set the expectation, and then you have some ripple effects. But we're already finding that students are showing up at more of the workshops and are citing that the use of the tools is making a difference. And these are students who would not be eligible for accommodation, right, for the most part. But they're benefiting from the tool that was designed for people with disabilities. Because the truth is, it may have been designed for one population, but the tools benefit everyone. I find it helpful from a time management standpoint. I'll have articles read to me while I'm sorting through my mail. I love it. I love it. Here's another example of a partnership. So being a community college, we have an open access approach, and we have some developmental education courses, including Math 20. Math 20 is the most very basic math, right? And what we found is that we have students who struggle in this class, students who might take this class again and again, and who really struggle. And so we had faculty who recognized we need to try something different. We need more techniques in our toolbox. And what they wanted to do was create hands-on learning opportunities. And again, this is for everyone, right? This isn't just specifically for students who have identified disability, this is for everyone. And so what they did is they wanted to create this handbook that had hands-on activities that they could do in class and that were tied tightly to the curriculum. And their original idea was to do this basically as like a Word document, right? And they would just print it off or have it. But because we were talking to each other early on, we recognized there was a potential to leverage technology and make this even more robust, make it even more powerful. So what we ended up doing, you have a screenshot on screen right now of this HTML interface, this web page that we built that provides all that math content in HTML with MathML. So with MathJax, people can access with their Braille display, with their screen reader, and have that math either passed into Nemeth, which is a specialized math Braille, or be spoken correctly. And that's actually tricky because math, you have to treat math with good structure if you want it to be available to assistive technology. So we did that. And then we also made sure that it was available in other formats. The whole thing's Creative Commons licensed, so people are welcome to share and use this themselves. So we have different formats, including Braille files, so that students, we can print them off and not have to do the accommodation step. It's already ready to go, right? The other thing that came from this project are these 3D printed fraction kits. And I actually brought one of them with me, so if anybody afterward wants to see them, I can pull it out. What I love about this is, again, this was student involvement, right? So how many of you have maker spaces? I see some hands, yeah. It's neat, right? So 3D printers are just one example. There's a lot of rapid prototyping technology that we can leverage. I'm really interested in using that kind of technology to create tactile learning objects. Not only for students who are blind, that's a population that comes to mind frequently, but many, many students find abstract paper, flat representations of things hard to really get the most from. So hands-on exploration helps a lot of learners. In this case, fractions is one of the key concepts in this Math 20 course, and it's one that throws a lot of people for a loop. They have a hard time learning the fractions. And so the idea was to have these kits. Now, Amazon sells them, people sell them. You can get these fraction kits, they're sold. But we ordered a set, and what we realized is it's built for children, right? Because that's often when this content is first taught. So the fraction kits were small. They were kind of they were meant for children. So we hired a student to come up with something better. And he was able to develop this prototype for a fraction kit, creating, printing, testing with different end users, using the technology, using the opportunity to learn what worked and what didn't. And he ended up with a design that is a little bit bigger, about 150% of the ones that you can get commercially, which were better for adult-sized hands. And he built in this nifty little ledge so that you can actually nest the pieces together and really see how 2/4 is 1/2. They take up the same space when you put them on top of each other, right? And we printed, I should have put in the photo of my team busy at work, because we were printing for more than days to get all these done. PCC is the largest college in Oregon. We're pretty big, and we wanted to have these kits available for all of our campuses, for all of our Math 20 instructors. So we had our printers going, and we were borrowing printers from our other campuses, and so we did it though. We produced all of these 3D printed fraction kits, made them available, and they have been in use ever since. And they are, again, Creative Commons licensed, so people are welcome to adapt and use yourselves. We have 2 versions, with Braille and without. And then, just speaking of the makerspace, I have to give a nod to one of the students this actually made a national story when it was first printed. This is a PCC student, Jordan, who used our makerspace to create his own prosthetic hand. And it ended up being an interesting project that has evolved from there, and they've been actually doing some custom hands for toddlers and children, and it's a way to personalize and have ownership over something that's often a scary transition and a difficult time. Insurance, as I said before, is often all you can get, right? And so you might get a hook, you might get a simple arm that can do certain things pretty well, but it might not do everything you want it to do. And so the idea of using that technology to innovate and to allow people to reinvent and to invent and create what works for them can be incredibly empowering. So we call it DIYAT. And we invite people from the community to come in and to use our 3D printers and to partner with us and to think about what are ways that we can use this technology. And if it's changing one person's life, or if it's an idea that then sparks, that's great. So if you have makerspaces, this community is one who can really, I think, bring some fresh insight into some of that work, some of the process. Right, so that's all great, right? But what we know is that it's not always gonna happen in that way. Sometimes technology does shut people out, right? So at the beginning of this presentation, I had that door with the question mark on it that was opening, but I mentioned how it's not always opening for everyone, right? Sometimes only for some. Unfortunately, what I have on the slide right now is a common experience. And what I have is a sign that says the shared path is closed. So we see this well-paved path heading up, and then there's a fence, right? And there's a little sign at the end that says, detour, you're gonna have to go around. This is what happens for our students and for each other, for employees, people who rely on technology to work and to learn. People head out on a shared path, and then at some point, there's a recognition that it won't work for everyone, right? The structure's not there, the AT can't pick it up. That refreshable Braille display that we looked at, it can do great if the content is well structured, But if it's not, that's like a fence. That's like a lack of a curb cut. That's whatever metaphor you want to choose. The path is not navigable, right? And what happens is sometimes we use accommodation and we say, here's the detour. Use this accommodation process. But to be honest, that's an othering experience for sure, right? We're all headed out together and then some of us have to depart. What happens is not all of us rejoin, right? Sometimes that detour is actually an off-ramp and we don't get those students back or those employees back. And that's heartbreaking and not right because we're talking about losing talent. So the reality is, AT can usually read good design. So we have a responsibility to make sure we are aware and in conformance with things like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We know that often things aren't designed in accordance, and we end up with bad design. It's like lipstick on a pig, right? Because it looks great up front, might have a pretty visual interface, but it's lacking on the back end. There's no structure there. That's a problem. And as I mentioned, accommodation really can't fix it. I'll give you an example, a student who enrolls in a course, and there's a homework site, and the student might have paid a lot of money for the access code to get to that homework site, right? I had an example just last term where the container, the front end, was really pretty. Everything seemed to work. But once we got inside the actual homework, none of the links for listening to exercises you couldn't get access to them with a screen reader. You couldn't actually complete the homework. And the trick then is, well, what do we do? People in my position, disability services. I think often there's an expectation that you can always use accommodation to fix whatever problem. And that's not always the case, right? I can't get behind that firewall. I can't get behind that third-party platform's interface to make changes to it. Often what we end up having to do is hiring an aide, another person, to kind of sign in, we use Zoom or whatever, to be the eyes and ears and mouse clicker for the student. It's not ideal. It's not great. In my mind, it's not equally effective access, but it's the best we can do given the situation. So my final words are, we need to look closely, right? We need to innovate equitably, and we need to look to those standards. And if we do that, it may not be as overwhelming to align with the standards as it is when we view innovation as happening first and accessibility happening after as a layer on top. That's what makes it feel overwhelming, right? When it's baked in, it's just part of the process. But when we're trying to circle back and add it on top, it feels like a tsunami. It feels like that exponentially increasing curve that I talked about earlier. So we can get there, not overnight, but over time. And I think it happens over time by recognizing those opportunities to innovate, those opportunities to extend the benefits of innovation in a more equitable way, and by reframing some of those techniques like captioning away from being viewed as an accommodation and toward being viewed as good business practice and honestly just plain good teaching. And that's it. I think we have time for just a few questions. If